Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 3 of our kind of chat GPT sessions / AI sessions in education. As a reminder, this is brought to you by our donors, which you can see on the screen here. You can donate to our work here at Human Restoration Project to make all of this work free and accessible. You can find resources, podcasts, guides, all of the other sessions, plus an upcoming AI handbook that curates pretty much everything that Trevor has helped us prepare, which you can find all of that on this massive Figma. I'm going to go ahead and put this Figma in the chat so you can also check it out and dive to it with us. Note that we'll be working in where it says this giant start here in part 3. Parts 2 and 3 or parts 2 and 1 are just for reference. Finally, we do have an ongoing funding drive. You can learn more at humanrestorationproject.org/support and get a pretty cool like nostalgic looking mug with original artwork. It reminds me of those Hallmark mugs that you would get. It has like this like really old school aesthetic that I'm really digging. But before we go any further, I guess brief introductions. I'm Chris. I'm part of Human Restoration Project. I'm the ED. Again, our work centers on helping teachers, students move into more human-centered systems, building out systems of assessment, new ways of looking at quote unquote discipline, moving towards purpose finding and thinking about ed tech as well, which we'll talk about more here. Trevor, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. I am Trevor Elio. I'm an upper school English teacher at Greenwich Country Day School. I'm also a doctoral student at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where I'm studying the intersection of disciplinary literacy and youth literacies. I've been experimenting with ChatGPT in my local context. I actually had an ethical dilemma related to ChatGPT that I shared with Chris and Nick in our Discord server. So I'll be talking about that as well today.
Awesome. So I guess just a brief catch up if you haven't seen our other sessions. If you want to go back and check out session one details just basically what ChatGPT is and isn't, as well as just AI more generally. We're going to use those terms interchangeably. Note that ChatGPT is a form of AI. It's not really AI in the form of like HAL 3000 or something, but it's the discourse, it's the zeitgeist to say AI and ChatGPT. So we will. So that's part one. That's what part 1 was. Part 2 is a huge collection of different activities. We'll put this link in the chat and in our YouTube description. This has a bunch of activities that you'll find eventually in our AI handbook that both utilize AI for transforming classrooms and doing new things you couldn't do it before, but also critically analyze AI and recognize the ways at which it makes us more human in a sense. It makes us recognize the things that we can do that ChatGPT can't, and also speeds up things as well for teachers and students and some cool differentiation stuff. Note that if you're on the Figma, easiest way to move around is you can either use this move tool on the bottom of the little hand, or you can hold down middle mouse if you're using a mouse and move around. The zooming is in the upper right, or you can do control or command scroll wheel, depending on what browser you're on, I should say operating system, Mac versus Windows.
Mac
Trevor,
folks.
yeah, you want to go ahead and start us off with the ethics discussion?
Yes. We entitled this section, "What's the Deal? Headlines and Stories." Because if you have only been consuming ChatGPT and AI related content via the news, you've been in for a pretty wild last, I guess, year, just about, maybe a little bit under a year. And the types of news that has been coming out ranges from the comical to the frightening. So on the comical side of things, we have people like playing with the surrounding landscape of what the Mona Lisa would look like, remixing album covers like we see with the Beatles.
Yeah.
We have an Onion-esque Paragraphica, a camera that takes photos using location data. It describes the place you were at and converts it into an AI-generated photo. I'd read that a few times to be like, oh, wait, that's literally just like what a camera does, but just with the unnecessary addition of an AI. So we've been seeing a lot of these kind of like silly applications. And I definitely think that there's
blimp. Yeah.
I think,
yeah.
yeah, of course. And then a bulldog, naturally. I've heard that the streets of Liverpool are covered with bulldogs. And I think that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with this silly application. The only concern, considering we'll be talking about criticality, is if we only see ChatGPT as this silly, funny, goofy thing that we can use to manipulate photos without considering the implications of that in other contexts. But we'll be getting into that stuff later. The frightening ways that AI has been reported, as we see here, could replace the equivalent of 300 million jobs. It played a pretty significant role in the recent writer strikes going on in Hollywood, as well as with the Actors Guild, considering we now have AI ability to do like facial recognition and capture, not just text. And then recently, I feel like there's been an uptick of this since the school year kicked off, which is professors and teachers using tools like Chat Zero and Turnitin, which are frankly riddled with errors and false positives when it comes to cheating, and flunking their students. So we're going to kind of talk about what an alternative way to think about and to handle those situations might be that doesn't require us surveilling our students, and assuming that these tools that have been produced are always accurate. But yeah, it's pretty dystopian. There's a whole other slice if you maybe scratch one layer deeper from like the mainstream discourse on ChatGPT and in a little bit more tech circles where people are really talking about like the end of days. And I'm going to talk about in the final section about what some of the implications might that be, and then how that hype cycle is actually dehumanizing the way that we think and talk about AI and technology in general. But um, like we've written here, it's worth taking these things seriously, but not on their own terms. So we want to kind of pop the bubble of this conversation and introduce as much criticality as we can. So Chris and I were talking before the call, we certainly not the only people talking about ChatGPT. There are plenty of other guides and workshops out there, but what HRP does so well, and why I'm really glad to be collaborating with them, is bringing in a sense of humanity and criticality into these conversations. So that's kind of going to be our unique take today.
For sure. And our goal is to be as nuanced as possible
For
as
sure.
people who use AI and ChatGPT, both in classroom application, but also personally. We see the benefits of how these concepts can be used and how this tech can be implemented. But this whole part that we're talking about today is the but part. It's the giant
Yeah.
asterisk of like,
Yeah.
keep all of this in mind as we're talking about these things. And probably, honestly, the most important one that I really wanted to lead with is data privacy policy, which is certainly not a sexy topic. Something that most people really just don't care about. And it's just like, well, who cares? I mean, everything else I use online pretty much has these data privacy concerns. But what's especially interesting about ChatGPT and image generation software is how your data is collected in a way that we really haven't seen before. In fact, it's banned in Italy. A fun fact, I didn't know that until I started researching this because of how it violates the GDPR in Europe. Because of how it openly collects your data. So some things to consider, the data privacy policies found here. But before you use this in a classroom, some things you want to note are, first off, you can't use any open AI product, aka ChatGPT, if you're under 13. Just it's explicitly banned according to the policy, and it does require a parent guardian signature if you use it between 13 and 17. That's in their own privacy policy. Note that everything that you do is recorded and stored, including files that you upload. So a lot of people are using services that draw upon ChatGPT's framework. So for example, I'm pretty sure that Ask Your PDF, which is a PDF collection software, uses ChatGPT's data set to perform its actions, which means that it's realistic that if you upload, let's say, your tax forms as a way to analyze your tax forms quickly or something, well, that data can be used to refine the AI further, which has the implication that personal details you upload could be anonymized, but then used somewhere else, which has some critical concerns, both in terms of what data could pop up in the future, but also what if someone gained access to this information? What if like the cybersecurity had some kind of breach? All of your personal information is also stored. That includes things like addresses and social security numbers. If that information were to go up somewhere, like if you were to upload a file that had your social security number, that had your address, etc. And on top of all of that, any data that you enter can be shared with vendors, service providers, affiliates, legal entities, and human AI trainers. So if you're having a very personal conversation with ChatGPT, a lot of like mental health services are leaning into AI, which has some interesting implications. But just keep in mind that anything you type in there could be accessed by an actual person who could read through everything that you wrote. There are some ways that you can disable some of this so that your data isn't stored. But as far as I could read into this, it's still stored for 30 days. So even if you enable the feature that deletes your chats, they still store it on their servers for up to 30 days, which means it's still being harvested in this way. All of that to say that the implications of this is, first off, we would never make the claim that every single kid should be forced to use any ed tech tool, let alone ChatGPT in the classroom. Like running some kind of activity where it's like, hey, everyone, we're going to all sign into ChatGPT and do an activity together, can be very problematic because of this reason. It could very much be an opt-in style approach where students, if they feel comfortable using it after you've gone through all this information, they could go ahead and use it in the exact same way that a lot of ed tech does similar stuff with collecting student data and teacher data. Another way you could do these types of activities is, if you're comfortable as a teacher, just doing it in front of the class, projecting it up on the screen, and then talking about it together, and that would work as well. It is a good way to consider, though, data privacy more broadly. For example, what if you divided the class and had each group analyze a part of a tech tool's privacy policy? So you could open up the ChatGPT privacy policy, divide it up into sections, and have them identify, what are the things that are going on here. That has interesting application as well toward TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, any tech tool that kids are using, so they understand how their data is being used. And of course, a lot of people don't care, but there is a concern, especially in this case. Another thing to consider is having students create a privacy pledge. So talking about responsible use of AI and technology, guidelines to ensure that certain data isn't shared. So like, for example, if we're going to use AI in the classroom, what are things that you should never type in to ChatGPT as a platform, knowing what we know about how that data is being used? So that could be, a challenging conversation, because it's a really weird tightrope to be walking between, hey, we're using this, but also it's hyper problematic. But at the exact same time, it's a necessary conversation, because realistically, your kids are going to be using this platform anyway. So we kind of have to talk about it, or else kids are just going to be kind of in the wild west of AI without that additional context. So yeah, just so you're aware. Anything on that before I move on, Trevor?
No, I really like the idea that you kind of put forth, Chris, of them being like conscious and critical consumers of
I'll put this
whether
up
it's
too.
like the legal information that they're taking in, or it's the terms of service themselves. I just think that that is the best approach. It's like, we're going to use this thing, but not unconsciously, and not without a little bit of investigation first. I think that's always finding walking the line between being censorious but also being like naive, I think, is always tricky. And I think some of the ideas that you put forth there are a really good way to walk that tightrope. So
Awesome. And shout out to Thomas in the chat for linking one example of this,
yes,
where AI researchers leaked 28 or 38 terabytes
it's a
of
lot of
company.
data.
That's
A
a lot of
lot.
data going out there. And I would imagine that as these AI platforms continue to grow, and every company seemingly in the world is offering some kind of AI prompt service, that the implications of this from a cybersecurity standpoint are not good, considering things people are putting in there. Then, kind of in the same vein of things, talking about copyright. So it's one thing to center, hey, this is how the data I'm putting into AI could be used in problematic ways. How is the data coming out of the AI being interpreted in problematic ways, in the way that it's being trained or collected? A way that many folks, I think, heard about this more recently was in the recent Writers Guild strike. which actually resulted in a change on AI policy regarding the WGA contract. You can see here in the contract, it says that AI will not be able to write or rewrite literary material, and AI generated material will not be able to be used as source material. So an exec won't be able to ask ChatGPT to come up with a story and ask writers to turn it into a script that the execs own the rights to. There's a
Mm.
major concern across pretty much every creative profession that AI will be trained to replace any type of creative jobs. So I could feed all of the Christopher Nolan scripts into a ChatGPT framework and then have it write films like Christopher Nolan. And they probably wouldn't be as good, but it would be good enough that perhaps churn some money at the box office. Same thing with voice actors being able to, like, being forced to record a bunch of lines into a program that then systematically can interpret that into AI. So we should kind of consider the fact that if we're going to be talking about college and career readiness and talk about what is the world like in terms of this AI landscape, we have to be able to talk about these ethical concerns, because jobs are going to increasingly have norms concerning AI and regulations and policies. We have to be very careful about what data we provide that could ultimately, take us away, take us out of the picture.
So
Speaking
real quick,
of,
Chris, two
yeah,
two
yeah,
additional wrinkles that have come out very
yeah.
recently. One is I think that Stephen King and George R. Martin and some other authors are, I don't know if they already have or if they have like legal proceedings being brought up to take ChatGPT to court over the fact that they are claiming it scraped their works and stuff written by them. And they are, I'll be curious if that has further implications in addition to things happening in Hollywood, just in the wider publishing industry. But the one that I really wanted to share that I saw like just yesterday on my drive home was Meta recently released this, I guess, like human AI chatbot service where Tom Brady and I think one of the Kardashians and then another Hollywood star person basically uploaded their likeness to Facebook, and it's using their likeness and their voice to not say things as they would say them, but just as like a general AI companion to talk to. And the implications of that I feel like are astounding, and it's very strange. Oh, Snoop Dogg was another person. I just see you saw. Yes, Chris, did you see that article?
No, I was referring to the Black Mirror episode
Oh, yeah,
that
yeah.
Tom's
But
talking
I
about.
mean,
Yeah,
it's literally that Black Mirror episode.
yeah,
I know that right now their implications, the things that they want to do, but we've just seen, like I said, Snoop Dogg, one of the Kardashians, and Tom Brady literally like do what Joan did with Meta, which I feel like is very fascinating.
yeah, yeah. And j- brief tangent here for a second, but it is interesting to note that the way at which OpenAI has been able to train its data is typically, not entirely, but typically a result of agreeing to policy terms on other websites. So, for example, ChatGPT takes a lot of its data from Reddit. And you could make the argument, well, how can they take my data from Reddit in order to train their software if I didn't give them permission to? It's like, well, that's what the TOS says. The TOS says that they're allowed to take your data and give it to vendors and services. So all of your data is now there.
Yikes.
This is like a whole ecosystem of ethical technological quandaries. One of which is ethical image generation. And this is something that we didn't mention in our previous sessions, but it is something worth noting, and honestly something that Nick and I at HRP have relatively recently learned and changed up a lot of our policies surrounding. So it's worth noting that not all image generators are also generated or created equal. A lot of folks are familiar with Midjourney and Dolly as ways to create AI artwork. And it's worth noting that Midjourney and Dolly don't compensate artists, right? It's sourcing data from what they say is open access information online, but that's obviously not the case. Many artists are suing both Midjourney and Dolly because of their work popping up. Because how could it be inspired by them and pop up and have that style unless it was sourced by them? But even more obvious are watermarks that appear. So you can see here, this is an image. I generated this on Midjourney as an example, or someone did. I took it. But you can see, like, there's obviously a watermark being generated on here by the AI, which means it had to have been sourced from something that has watermarks, or else the AI wouldn't know to do it. I wrote on here that in many ways, AI is the wild west of IP and copyright law.
Hmm.
People are still trying to figure out what exactly you even do with this, or how it works, or if there's a way to do this ethically. A service we would recommend at the time of writing this could change, but a service that we would recommend right now is perhaps Adobe Firefly. It's mostly free. It's offered through the Adobe Creative Cloud, and it's not perfect, but they do only source from Adobe stock, which is good. So it's only their own content, and they do compensate Adobe Creative Cloud stock people for contributing to this kind of AI thing. Another example would be Shutterstock has an AI generation service now, which only sources through Shutterstock and also pays contributors. So it's a way to navigate the honestly really cool technological feat of generating art. Like, it is really cool. If you use Photoshop recently, you can like fill in parts. It's neat, but not have as many ethical concerns about using it in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that model of compensation, I'm hoping that that will create some sort of ethical pressure on other companies to adopt a similar model. As long as that compensation is like somewhat fair, I could see that being like a solution that I never would have envisioned or thought of. So I think that's pretty cool.
All right.
So lastly, I'm gonna kind of zoom into the implications of this in an educational, like, teacher chalk face context. So it got me thinking, in addition to all of these sort of like broader societal and creative concerns about just the way that we talk and think about attribution in education in general. So, being an English teacher, it's, within my purview to be thinking about like, oh, how to teach kids how to cite MLA and APA. And even just like a decade ago when I started teaching, the big question was like, should we teach kids how to like memorize MLA citation, or how to like be able to do I think having them know how to do an in-text citation is fine, but like I argued with teachers who were saying that kids need to be able to do by hand, by memory, a perfect like end of text like citation page. I just thought that was like very silly. But we've come away from there. Just in the last 10 years, I feel like it's pretty well, at least in most of the teachers that I talk to and work with, that like using tools like Citation Machine or Zotero, or there's like Google Doc integration to do your
Right.
citations. All that kind of stuff is kind of like accepted as just general practice, and I think that's great. I think it's a lot less friction to do something that is important. But I'll even speak from the eye here. It is meant that I don't have a little mini unit or module where I'm talking about like citations as much. It's just something that I do like a few mini lessons on. And what that leads to is that the fact that if we're thinking about this in the context of AI, the notion or idea of like, I don't want to use the word intellectual theft, but it just like of taking others' ideas and claiming that they are your own, that's not really an ethical conversation that students have had. So I would assume that there are a number of students who probably don't even necessarily realize that what they're doing is taking the ideas from others, or in this case, an AI, and claiming their own. And like, what are the ethical implications of that? And another kind of topic near dear to my heart is the way that academic knowledge is becoming increasingly multimodal. So now you have people who are doing podcasts and video essays and all sorts of other sort of digital ways of producing knowledge, and there hasn't really been a conversation about how to attribute or to cite there. It's kind of an interesting emerging discourse in like different YouTuber spaces of like, how are they doing their citations, how are they citing other YouTubers, how are they citing academic papers. So that just opens up a whole other questions about like, do we need to have broader conversations about the way that we discuss attribution and citation in academic spaces and in classroom spaces. And I think another piece of this is the fact that students have grown up in a kind of a remix culture where ideas are freely exchanged, remixed, copied, and shared effortlessly and thoughtlessly. And I'll put myself in that category, for the most part. I think the notion of one person owning an idea or a concept or a meme or something like that is something that students aren't quite as used to, because so much of their experience with text and sharing ideas happens in online spaces where that's encouraged, right? That's the entire premise of TikTok, is like doing threads and replies. And I'm blanking on the exact TikTok terminology. But basically, kids are sort of raised in this milieu of it's okay and encouraged to share things and to remix things, because that's how you go viral. That's how you build other people's work. So it's just, I think there are just broader conversations that need to happen about what does it mean to ethically attribute your ideas to other people. How do you recognize, the intellectual inspiration for what you do? And it just sort of feels, thinking about, the Modern Language Association gathering at a yearly conference to talk about where a semicolon versus italicized text goes feels very, very antiquated. And I'm really curious to see what's going to kind of emerge from there. And just another quick anecdote, in my doctoral program, it is all about multimodality. So we have been encouraged, and in some of our more practitioner focused writings have had to include and embed media. And I had two of our different of the different professors and one TA being like, no, you need to cite your video this way, and another one being like, you need to do it that way. And then we had a broader conversation about like, oh wow, I guess like these conventions around citation for video, even, which has been, we've been able to embed video and text for quite a while. They're all still emergent. So, bringing that back to I really wonder how ready our students are to even understand the ethical implications of, that AI are bringing into the classroom, considering we really haven't been having good conversations about attribution even pre ChatGPT.
And the nice thing is that by having conversations about those things, it allows you to be more transparent. In
For
this
sure.
case, about using ChatGPT or not, right? If you introduce a concept where it's like, hey, you're allowed to use AI on this assignment, cite when you use it, and let's talk about why. That also opens up the door to saying, hey, you can't use ChatGPT on this assignment, and here's why.
Wait,
Uh,
Chris, did I tell you about I told my kids that we were doing this lit crit activity last week where my kids are reading a piece of literary criticism. It's a pretty challenging work, and I'm like, if you guys want to pull up ChatGPT and ask questions, because I was talking some about the history of Arthur Miller as an author, and all my kids like looked around really sketchily when I said that they could use ChatGPT, and they're like, is this like a psyop? Like, are you trying to catch the kids that have ChatGPT accounts? And I was like, guys, no, like, I want you to use it. And they like, a lot of kids were like, no, this feels like really sketchy. Eventually, they warmed up to it, but it was just really funny because I think it shows how they see teachers thinking and talking about AI, right? If a teacher talks about AI, then like, they have an angle, which is unfortunate.
Right. Right. It allows for some radical transparency if you open up the doors to talking about these things.
For sure.
I used to, so I used to teach digital design, and a pretty huge part of that curriculum, or at least I made it a pretty huge part, is talking about fair use. And Thomas says in the chat there
Mm.
about like hip hop and sampling.
Oh,
And
yes. That's
in my case, I'm a
really
huge
good.
breakcore fan, which is literally entirely samples that you're taking from other means. And at what point is something fair use? At what point can you remix what other people have done? Those are conversations that you can have in a classroom, because if you don't have those conversations, then kids may not critically investigate those things and they'll just kind of do whatever they want. Like they'll not see the
Yeah.
implications of why it matters. This goes both from a AI angle in terms of citing AI, using AI, when you should use it, when you shouldn't use it, but also just like, as you said, Trevor, like, can I reference a YouTube video? Can I pull text from Wikipedia? These are just additional conversations to have that we need to slow down and consider attribution. It also helps us avoid the situation where we're concerned about kids cheating all of the time because
Yeah.
we've never had a deep, nuanced conversation about what does it mean to cheat. Like, why are we even having kids write papers, and what's the point of it? There
Yeah.
is a purpose, but kids might not know. And certainly if our goal is just to get through as many things as possible quickly, AI makes a lot of sense, as it will do that real
Mhm.
fast.
So I think that what we were just talking about bleeds really easily into this. And as somebody who is a classroom teacher who, I still, as much as I love multimodality and bringing other mediums besides, literary essays, like writing is still a pretty integral part of my curriculum. I think that print has affordances that like we shouldn't abandon just because ChatGPT exists. So that's my long roundabout way of saying I understand the sentiment that people have in terms of wanting to catch people. However, what we are seeing is essentially this like surveillance arms race that is sort of launching right now. And there was a really good Twitter thread that was shared recently. Well, really good in that it's exemplary of what I'm talking about, bad in terms of its content, where it looks like a teacher accused a student of using ChatGPT and because they got a false positive from Turnitin, which is a tool that has historically been used to catch students who are plagiarizing, but now I guess is trying to bill itself as catching AI generated text. Chat Zero is another good example of a tool that is out there that creates a lot of false positives, but many teachers are seeing it as sort of like this message from the heavens. It's like, okay, no, this is 100% legit. I went to this website, it says it catches AI cheating, I know kids are cheating, and it just sort of becomes this like confirmation bias mechanism that reinforces the anxiety that teachers already have. The post that sort of launched this conversation got 7.6 million views, and a bunch of teachers and students were kind of talking about similar experiences that they'd had, the anxiety that has cropped up around this. It reminds me, I guess, a year or two ago, some like test delivery software or platform was using like eye tracking software where like if you had a
Proctorio.
camera on, yeah, and
Yeah.
it feels very much like that. Their kids literally feel as though they're in this like panopticon of surveillance at all times. And what that does to the relationship between teacher and student is incredibly damaging. And it creates this sort of when I was talking to my kids about it, I was like, I don't want this to feel like some sort of Tom and Jerry-esque chase where it's like the goal is to catch the kids, and that distracts us from the deeper purpose of like, well, why are we writing, or like why is it unethical to take someone else's ideas and claim them as your own. And I think that there needs to be a lot more robust conversation around like what it means to cheat, or what what does I want to say, like, I don't want to say what does ethical surveillance look like, but what does it look like to deal with the implications of students potentially cheating on an assignment, in this sort of post ChatGPT world that we're living in. And I'll give just sort of an example in my context. I had what I think was my first ChatGPT use for an assignment where they were asked not to use it, and I didn't use I didn't use Turnitin. I didn't use any of the other Chat Zero tools or anything like that. But for users who have been on it enough, you'll notice there are certain tendencies that AI large language models have when it writes. There's no idiosyncrasies. There's no weird word usage or term slippage. It's incredibly consistent and coherent. So if teachers are like looking for AI usage on assignments where they've asked students not to, I would highly encourage them to, just like we are with our students, get educated about what it looks like when ChatGPT is writing text so you can have a conversation. And I plan on just having a dialogue with that student, reminding him of the conversation we had at the beginning of the year about ethical use of AI, and just sort of using that as a broader conversational starting point with the rest of my class for our future writing assignments, instead of like, oh, I'm going to put it on to Turnitin, and then I'm going to report him to the academic dean and just say, I caught him, I got him, and then use that to like scare the other kids. Um, that adversarial relationship that I see forming with a lot of teachers and faculty is like very scary. And I think that it's damaging to the broader mission and vision of what we're doing as educators. And I think it further delegitimizes writing as a form, because it just becomes something that we are demanding kids do for its own sake. And if kids are like, okay, well, writing is pointless because ChatGPT does it, um, that feeling exists because they don't understand what writing as a form can do, how it can be a tool for self-expression, and they just see it as a way to spit out information that their teachers ask them to memorize or think about, as opposed to a medium for sense making, which I'm going to be talking about a little bit in the next section.
Right. Two quick things on that. The first relates to this idea of punishment as a result of cheating, or whatever you want to call it, plagiarism, etc. And I think it fits into a broader progressive lens of just giving a kid a zero and why that doesn't work. Like if you
Yeah.
do anything, whether it be copy text from ChatGPT, whether it be copy off someone else's paper, whatever it might be, we know that giving a kid a zero and moving on and saying you did a bad thing is not going to curb future behavior. It's probably just going to make the kid resent you and double
Yeah.
down on finding other ways to kind of get around these situations. Or, maybe they didn't even realize they were doing something wrong. A lot of this stuff comes out of like pressure, I feel like I'm afraid I'm going to get a bad grade. I'm not really sure what's going on. I'm super busy. And we need to be able to have more open conversations about what does it mean to cheat and why does that matter, both in terms of pedagogically, like through an assignment, but also in terms of like why the assignment matters, as you're getting at. Thomas asked in the chat, like,
Yeah.
is copying text from ChatGPT really cheating? And if so, like, what's the point of that? Is writing really routine vomiting of facts? Is that we want to
Yeah.
assess? And that problem is also twofold. One problem is that sadly, a lot of the ways that writing is assigned in classrooms is pointless. Like it's something where you do it and then you get a grade at the end and then you move on with your day, and that was the entire assignment. It didn't really have any point to it. So part of this is making more purposeful assignments to begin with, but the second part, and also slowing down so you can actually dive into the writing component. But I think the second part is there's nothing wrong with a teacher setting protocols to say, hey, for this assignment, we're not going to use ChatGPT, and here's why. Because
Yeah.
although ChatGPT can write a lot of really complex, nuanced things, what it struggles with is more creative, interesting things that people actually would want to read. Like ChatGPT writes like a textbook. It's very banal. Like it's just not a fun
Yeah.
thing to read. Versus comparing it to like a great work of literature or like a YouTube video script that you really like, it's going to be a lot tonally different. And if we teach kids about the importance of writing in that way, and we dive into like this is why we're doing it this way, then you can't have a conversation about like this seems a lot like ChatGPT. Can we talk about this for a bit and just have those conversations and steer that discussion? We can do that in a humane way without just being this like overseer at the front of the room that just yells at kids whenever we think that they're doing something wrong.
Yeah, and I think to respond to that good point, Thomas, I think that there are writing assignments that are given that the goal is to basically reproduce something that was said to you in class, or to copy or mimic some sort of form that you have been asked to write in. And I think that there are assignments where writing is being used as a tool for like sense making or synthesis. And I think that whenever we outsource our sense making to ChatGPT, or whenever our students do that, I think that is when the issue arises, right? When it's removing their the opportunity for them to think, to make meaning, and to engage with something, as opposed to it being used as like a vehicle to deliver rote information, um, which I think sets us up to the next video,
Yeah.
or section rather. So this next section that we're going to be looking at is kind of going to be like a mini lesson on what ChatGPT can't do. What are the limitations of ChatGPT as a platform, as it relates to learning. There it has been no shortage of anxiety and hand wringing over like the future of education as a field as a result of ChatGPT being created, and people being like, oh my gosh, it can do all the things that teachers do, but faster. And I want to challenge and complicate that by just kind of doing a miniature discussion about how it is that learning actually occurs and how we think. And I hope this is taken in the context of these are all things that ChatGPT, no matter how refined it gets, can't do. So I kind of kick off by saying like ChatGPT it delivers information more efficiently than any single teacher ever could. So I think that the wrong move is to assume or say that teachers can't be replaced if their only goal is to deliver content to students, because I think that like anyone who's played on it can see it can do that very well. The problem, I think, isn't trying to be more efficient than machines, but the problem that we see learning as a question of efficiency, as a matter of delivering, remembering, and retrieving facts. So I found this really great framework um, from Stillwell and Harmon, and they call it the 5 E's of sense making. So basically, anytime students engage in any meaning making process, that learning is affected by the fact that it is embodied, embedded, inactive, emotive, and extended. So I'm going to talk about that pretty briefly, just as a way to kind of give folks a framework to think about, what are things that humans need and what are things that humans do that ChatGPT can never replace. So the first is that sense making and meaning making are embedded. So recognizing that individuals are situated within social and cultural contexts that influence their experiences and meanings. A lot of this is also shaped by like Vygotsky's work and sociocultural theories of learning. And it's the idea that meaning sort of takes shape and form in social settings and with other people. A kind of a silly example of that I was just thinking about this morning is my son, when he wakes up, when I'm trying to get like my life together, we'll watch like an episode or two on YouTube. And he calls them episodes. He doesn't say like channel or video or YouTube. And that word takes different meaning in the social context like of our relationship, right? The word episode is not what YouTube actually uses. And if I didn't like have that relationship with my son that I do, where I know what he means, that word would take on no meaning. So that's just kind of an example of how being in a social situation and being in relationship with others changes the way that we understand what is being said and communicated. James Paul G does a lot of research on this, on sociocultural sort of framings of literacy. And he talks about academic disciplines or other domains as a lived and historically changing set of distinctive social practices. And it's in these practices that content or information or knowledge is generated, debated, and transformed via distinctive ways of talking, thinking, valuing, acting, and often writing and reading. And what that means is even if you are to be thinking about education in a sort of more traditional disciplinary way, our goal isn't just to fill kids' heads with historical facts, but to have them understand that history is created by historians who are engaging in these certain social practices and interacting in ways that lead to the production of knowledge. So whenever we learn anything, it's really important for us to understand that we aren't just decontextualized brains in vats, but knowledge occurs through the sort of social interaction. So keeping in mind that sense making is embedded. And that brings us similarly to the fact that sense making and meaning making is embodied. So it refers to the idea that cognition and experience are inseparable from the body and its interaction with the environment. So Antonio Damasio is a cognitive scientist who does a lot of interesting work around this. And he says there's no such thing as a disembodied mind. The mind is implanted in the brain and the brain is implanted in the body. So, this could connect to things that are as clear and material as the fact that there's a ton of research that says when kids are hungry because they haven't been given the opportunity to eat breakfast, their cognition is going to be impaired. They're not going to be able to think as clearly. And if we just assume that the only way to, improve students' retrieval on a test is just to use cognitive load theory and these like really academic brain oriented ways of engaging with learning, we're forgetting the fact that our students aren't just brains, right? They are embodied beings, and there are a lot of other implications for the fact that they are embodied besides just the fact that being in pain or being hungry will prevent you from learning. There's a lot of interesting research about sort of affective states, as well as like how we learn, thinking in sports, for instance, like what does it mean to have a skill that is purely cognitive versus one that requires you to kick a soccer ball. So just keeping in mind that ChatGPT doesn't have any way of giving that sort of invisible hidden knowledge that comes from being in an embodied learning situation or context. It's just giving you information that you read on a screen. So I'll go ahead, Chris.
I was
Oh, I
just
thought you
going
were
that.
about.
No,
Okay, I
you're
thought you were
good.
about to jump in. So it's also emotive. So it highlights the role of emotions in shaping and influencing cognition and experience. And there is a really fantastic cognitive neuroscientist, Mary Helen Immordino Yang, who has done a lot of research on this. And she says that emotions are not add-ons that are distinct from cognitive skills. Instead, emotions like interest, anxiety, frustration, excitement, or a sense of awe in beholding beauty become a dimension of the skill itself. So, you can ask ChatGPT how to, build a sandbox for your kid. But and it can give you those skills, but it doesn't sort of talk about all of the other affective aspects that come with that. So in the context of school, it's thinking about, a kid who experiences anxiety whenever they're doing a math problem is going to be less able to do math. A kid who associates their learning of a certain subject with frustration is going to struggle in that subject, even if cognitively they have the ability to perform. And the reverse of that is true. There's a lot of research sort of looking at how whenever there is heightened emotional states in a positive way when kids are learning, they're more likely to remember that learning experience because it comes sort of loaded with emotional content that makes retrieval easier. So when we learn things, the sort of emotive or affective state that we're in can really shape how well we internalize it, remember it, or it could erect barriers that make understanding, meaning making, and remembering a lot more challenging. So two more. The next is enactive. So this emphasizes the active role of the individual in shaping their own experiences and meaning through interactions with the environment. And I think that this one is really important. It kind of ties into the point that I was making earlier about writing. Um, the fact that learning should be enactive is sort of saying that kids' ability to organize and think and engage with information and make meaning is like really the whole of the project of learning. As Jerome Bruner, who's a sort of famous educational philosopher and thinker, just kind of spoke to, we're not trying to make little living librarians who just can puke out any factoid related to a piece of information. We need to think about knowledge as a process and not just a product. So what does it look like to gain knowledge? That act or action of gaining knowledge or constructing knowledge is just as important, if not more important, than the product that emerges at the end. So when we are engaging in real learning, our students are going through these sort of enactive processes of thinking, of interacting with other people, with their environment, and sort of thinking about knowledge as this process that's undergone to create understanding as opposed to like just this fact, right? And what ChatGPT is really good at doing is providing us with the facts while skipping over those inactive processes that actually mean we know something. So kids could use ChatGPT and like be able to provide a whole bunch of words and facts about something, but they haven't gone through that inactive process that makes it real, that helps them internalize it and helps them think about it more deeply. There's a really good example in the National Research Council's How People Think and Learn that talks about a historian who is asked a question in a historical period that's unfamiliar to them. And a similar question is asked to an undergraduate student who just took a course on that historical period. And the historian is actually better able to think more deeply about the question being posed because they have a deeper understanding of what it means to do history. They've enacted their understanding and that knowledge a lot more than a student who has just memorized a bunch of facts about that period. So that's a good example of that. So lastly, sense making is extended. And it acknowledges that cognition and experiences extend beyond the boundaries of the individual's body and include external tools, artifacts, and technologies. So one of my concerns about ChatGPT is that it's going to increasingly embed us in these cognitive models of learning where the only thing that we're thinking about is like what goes into kids' heads and how much they can think and remember and retrieve. And the fact is that experts in different fields, and this is in Eddie Murphy Paul's book, The Extended Mind, one of the things that they do really well is they externalize their schema and their ideas and their thinking into external spaces. And again, when we're only engaging with a large language model, all that information just comes in the form of text that's spit back out at us. And students aren't being asked to extend their thinking into three-dimensional spaces and use like a concept map to understand an idea or to map out visually their essay because they're just asking a tool to do it for them. So the kind of reflection question that I want to pose is, AI might be a more efficient way to gain access to information. Like it falls short of all of the different ways that human cognition and sense making actually work. So what does that say about our sort of educational system and structures that so many people only view education as this process of learning and learning and retrieving of information in a way that ChatGPT can do better than us, right? I think the implications for that are a lot less about AI and a lot more about how we structure education.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. I appreciate you sharing all that information because it's so like I think it's kind of fresh, honestly, in terms of like talking about AI or talking about education and learning,
Yeah.
let alone artificial intelligence. Um, this is going to go like 5 or 10 minutes over the session, but three quick things that come to mind based off of what you just said. The first that's interesting, we kind of frame our entire book and meaning making of AI in this way, is that it's important to recognize with this framing that AI is a tool, not a system, right? In the exact same way that you wouldn't put all of your kids on Wikipedia every single day and say that's learning, that's a tool, right? Uh, that's a system. A tool is something that we utilize at times to assist us in doing something. And it seems that way the calculator helps us do math more efficiently, but that's not replacing the teacher within the system that you just put a bunch of kids on calculator and say learn something. Our fear as a result of kind of where Khan Academy, for example, is going with
Hmm.
AI is, oh, just put a bunch of kids on computers and they'll learn a lot of stuff, which leads me into point number two, which is learning is more than just retrieving facts. But the fact of the matter is that in most schools, sadly, a typical classroom is about factual resources. It's about learning things to regurgitate it onto a test or onto a paper. And if that is our model of education, then ChatGPT will destroy education, because I could just
Yeah.
take everything on the Google document, put it into a AI learning model, and it will do that thing. And along the way, not only am I probably not going to learn as much, but my personal fear is that it makes it seem like school is even more pointless than it already is. So I'm not going to see any value in learning, and therefore I'm just going to rely on the chat tool to do everything for me. And that has really interesting implications in this last point here. The only other I think really important thing to note is that this type of conversation that Trevor's brought up in terms of this 5 E's of sense making is a really good way to cover this content with your class. Like,
Yep.
bring these things into the classroom, talk about each one of these things, like spend 15 minutes each day talking about each one of these things and talking about how this relates to both what we're learning in the class, but how it relates to AI more generally, because it's going to help kids synthesize why this stuff matters and interpret it in ways that will help them become better learners. Um, in terms though of relying on AI and why that matters, like why does it matter if kids just take everything, plug it into AI, and we just move on with our lives? Like, who cares? And I think that's where it brings into this. And I'll briefly explain, starting off with this quote from Meredith Broussard about the concerns of hegemony. I'm getting very academic here, and artificial intelligence, or kind of upholding existing power structures. Dr. Meredith Broussard, in this book, More Than a Glitch, Confronting Race, Gender, and Ability Bias in Tech, great book, came out, I believe, this year. She writes, tech is racist and sexist and ableist because the world is so. Computers just reflect the existing reality and suggest that things will stay the same. They predict the status quo. By adopting a more critical view of technology and by being choosier about the tech we allow into our lives and our society, we can employ technology to stop reproducing the world as it is and get us closer to a world that is truly more just. And throughout that book, as well as the work that we're doing as an organization to investigate AI, it's worth noting that AI simply replicates the most plausible response. It takes what is the most thing that's said via social media or Wikipedia pages or articles or whatever it might be, and just states that typically as fact. And that's dangerous because, as we've spoken about before, AI has a tendency to have this tone about it that is the right answer. It's just, if you say, hey, what you just said, that's wrong, it's actually this, it'll say like, oh, my apologies, I didn't mean that, this is actually what I meant. And it could give you a completely wrong answer or super biased answer, and you just assume that's what it is. A couple examples here, just to do one of these. If you go on to ChatGPT, I have it open on my screen here, and I say, what are the top 10 books of all time, and I asked ChatGPT that question, certainly it will tell you like, hey, this isn't definitive, there's a lot of other books out there, but you could see it's going to replicate what you would typically find on classroom English 101 list of like, these are the best books. Mostly this canonical, very Western lens of literature: To Kill a Mockingbird, 1984, Pride and Prejudice, The Great Gatsby. And that's not to say that those books aren't great works, but it ignores the more modern interpretation of, well, what about other cultures? What about books that have historically been ignored? What about this more like DEIJ lens that has become more and more prevalent? ChatGPT typically isn't going to reference that because it's taking the most plausible response, the hegemonic response that you typically would find online. Similarly, if you ask ChatGPT questions about politics, not only is it going to give you this very hegemonic response, but it's not going to directly answer questions. Because of the way ChatGPT is programmed, it doesn't want to take opinions on things, which has problematic concerns about students using AI and how they view the world. For example, if I ask ChatGPT what political party in the United States is restricting LGBTQIA plus rights, I ask that question, typically it's going to tell me like, yeah, there is one that focuses a little more on rights, but it typically is more conservative, but it still gives me this very like wishy-washy response, like things will change over time, like they're more supportive but not really. Whereas in the real world, and I don't think it's super political to say this, there's obviously one political party that is limiting LGBTQIA rights and one that is not. Like there are certain things that are factually based on the laws that are passed on one party doing that, but it has this very wishy-washy tone to it. One other thing to consider is what this means for imagery. As again, a former digital design teacher, this is an activity I would do tomorrow if I were teaching, which is how hegemonic opinions are found in image generation. A great example of this, my favorite one, is like typing in into Adobe Firefly a futuristic a classroom in the future. You had to make it a certain length. Let me see if that works. So if I type in a classroom in the future, the interpretation of that is going to be, when it loads, yeah, you can see here, classrooms in rows, but with
Stop.
really cool like aesthetics, right? These giant cool looking windows. Like it looks badass, don't get me wrong, like it looks neat, but pedagogically nothing has changed, because our interpretation of a view of the future is simply replicating what we're doing now with futuristic aesthetics, as opposed to
Yeah.
fundamentally challenging what school is and how that could be different in 50 or 100 years. This has a very Mark Fisher capitalist realism vibe,
I
right?
was thinking
Where
that,
it's
Chris.
like,
Yeah.
hey, we can't imagine different futures because we're only based off what we're doing right now. And AI, by its nature, is simply remixing things that we're only doing right now. Another quick example here would be like, a farm in the future. If I type that in,
Thomas just said in chat he knows it was a chalkboard. They didn't even have whiteboards in the future.
yeah, they only have whiteboards in the future. So here we go, a farm in the future. Again, I'm not really sure what's futuristic about this. It's maybe the architecture. In the example, it gave me a lot of solar panels, which are great, but like that's a thing that already exists. If we're thinking about the future, I feel like, man, we could probably do a little bit better than like a solar field and some plants. A lot of like interesting farming stuff is going on surrounding like vertical farming, lab grown farming, farming that doesn't involve putting things even in the ground that requires pesticides, etc. There's a lot of really interesting futuristic tech that's out there that would improve our lives, but instead AI simply replicates what already exists. That's as much as it knows. From a more like marketing standpoint, just like career tech type stuff, if you ask it to design a typical mobile game app or a website app, a lot of people are designers are thinking about it in this way, it simply replicates the most generic look possible of a UI or website. It will take the website that you've seen a billion times and make that what a website template is. Whereas designers typically are trying to improve on these things. They're trying to iterate and innovate and find new ways of doing things. All of that to say, because AI simply reflects the hegemonic power structures today, it's replicating and remixing existing history. The danger of over relying on AI is that we can't imagine different futures. We become stuck in simply regurgitating the same things that we did today. And what I guess is like an allegory for the Matrix, or one of the various different hyper reality type philosophical questions. But for time purposes, we'll write more about that in the book. But it creates its own echo chamber. That's a great
For
point,
sure.
Thomas.
Yeah. No,
Let's quickly go through this one.
Yeah, no, I definitely think what you're speaking to, Chris, is one of the more like invisible but insidious aspects of this. It is a foreclosure of different social futures because all we are doing is remixing the past, but not in a way that leads to something new, right? Like in hip hop, you do a remix of a song and a new sound is produced, whereas here it's completely normative, right? The remixing is the bringing together of like this like narrow normativity as opposed to something new. And in a similar vein, I'm going to lean a lot on some of the work from Douglas Rushkoff here. He has a podcast and book called Team Human that I highly recommend. This is just sort of like our philosophical wrap up. I'm going to read a quote from him briefly. He says, "To many of the developers and investors of Silicon Valley, however, humans are not to be emulated or celebrated, but transcended, or at the very least re-engineered. These technologists are so dominated by the values of digital revolution that they see anything or anyone with different priorities as an impediment. This is a distinctly anti-human position, and it's driving the development philosophy of the most highly capitalized companies on the planet." And that's kind of what I'm speaking to in this last kind of part is how these hype cycles are taking agency away from people in a way that sort of, again, is a foreclosure of different possible futures with AI and with technology. And I think that it's really important that we recognize the power that technology has to influence the way that we think, the way that we engage with others. But I think it's also very important that like we remember that we are humans with agency. We have the ability to make our own decisions, to find other solutions. And I think that one of the problems with this, and even with people who I sort of see as like allies in this engaging with technology, like Tristan Harris, who was previously at Google and I believe Facebook, maybe the Center for Humane Technology. I'm grateful for them as allies, but I think it's also a problem to just assume that the good guys in tech will handle the problem. And us, sort of peasants to just wait for our techno feudal overlords to fix things, and we can just keep being digital serfs who are raking our little plot of land. And I want to be really careful and explicit to not be like conspiratorial about this. There was a really good Have You Heard pod recently. I highly recommend that podcast too. That was talking about people in these spaces oftentimes see what they're doing as advancing like human and humanistic goals, right? Like if you were to talk to Saul Khan, I think he seems like someone who is a true believer that what he is doing is going to help people and help kids learn. I think the problem is when the only people who have a seat at the table, the only people who have the capital to affect change in education are people who have really internalized those like optimized, efficient, sort of obsessed, sort of technologist discourses of like what it means to learn and what the purpose of education is. That's the issue. So this isn't like some sort of like grand conspiratorial thing where like these people are plotting to take over our minds. I really just think it's the problem of one particular orientation or philosophy or school of thought on learning and technology having all of the air in the room and affecting how the rest of the the world honestly is able to engage in learning and meaning making. So that for me is like the real crux of the issue. So I want to say, like, in short, let's not succumb to dystopian digital worry or passively hope for ChatGPT or its creators to spit out a solution for a utopian future. I've encountered this word protopian, which is just like each day better than the last, a lot, and I like that quite a bit. So how can we make ourselves, communities, and schools better than we were yesterday through technology? So
Yeah. Neoliberalism could be a hell of a drug. So
yeah,
it's our goal to kind of
1000%.
like, yeah, like hack what we can do with the benefits of what people have created because the technology is super cool. Like no one is saying that like this technology isn't super, at least we're not saying this technology isn't super impressive or it can't have transformative use cases in an educational setting, both for teachers and for students. We just need to keep these ethical considerations in mind as we
For
navigate
sure.
this relatively new space, especially as every single like LinkedIn or Twitter post is like, 10 ways that it's going to transform the way that you work and
10
live
ways to hack
forever.
your
Yeah.
workflow. Yeah.
It's a little more nuanced than that. We just need to take everything with a grain of salt. But yeah, we appreciate y'all for joining us and listening in. And yeah, be on the lookout for our AI handbook, which is coming out in the next 2 weeks. That will summarize all this and put it into a nice kind of like presentable packet for your school or for your own use, or also with kids. As well as if you happen to be in Columbus, Ohio, in late November. Was it November 19th? Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah,
18th,
no,
I think.
18th, November 18th. You can check out all of our social stuff for all the dates and details with that. But if you're in Columbus for NCTE already, Trevor is going to be joining us for a workshop there. Or I should really say we'll be joining Trevor for a workshop there, who invited us to talk about AI and do some stuff about our YouTube channel. So yeah, check you all soon, and appreciate you being here. And we'll yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Thanks
it.
for having me, Chris. I enjoyed
Yeah.
it.